In New Orleans, on the Saturday morning of March 28, 1846, prison guards led an emaciated girl from the parish prison to the gallows. The girl, Pauline, had just given birth a few days prior on the stone floor of her cell. As she walked to the gallows, Pauline was likely leaking blood and breast milk from her recent delivery. Her child had been ripped from her arms soon after birth, never again to be reunited. Who, if anyone, had helped Pauline deliver her child? Was she provided anything other than her dirty shift and the straw on the floor to absorb her water breaking, her blood in the placenta? Was there even a cloth to clean the amniotic fluid off the newborn child? Was there a string to tie off the umbilical cord before Pauline was forever severed from her baby? Perhaps no one helped Pauline deliver her child, and she was left with the anguish of a retained placenta and the intense pain of pushing another human out of her body. A few months after Pauline's execution, the Pictorial Times, a British newspaper based in London, published an article titled "Slavery in the United States, the Tragedy of Pauline," to use Pauline's story to promote the abolitionist cause and illustrate the horrors of slavery. The article described the brutal and licentious white plantation owner who enslaved Pauline as having sexually assaulted her, seeing her as his, quote, chattel personal to all intents and purposes whatsoever. She became a victim of his lust. The article states that after being abused by her master, Pauline, quote, triumphed and insulted her new mistress. In other words, repaid in some degree the scorn and abuse with which her mistress had made her painfully familiar. The article is vague in specifying how exactly Pauline insulted her mistress, but states that Pauline was accused of beating her mistress, was then tried and found guilty and condemned to die. When it was discovered during the trial that Pauline was pregnant, her execution was delayed until the birth of her child. The article then zooms out its focus from Pauline to describe the stark contrast between her and the other women in the city. Quote, young mothers smiled through their tears upon their newborn children, and maidens and matrons of that great city sat in their cool verandas and talked of love and household joys and domestic happiness, while all that dreary time the poor slave girl lay on the scanty straw of her dungeon, waiting, with what agony the dear and pitying God of the white and black only knows, for the birth of the child of her adulterous master. Horrible. The article juxtaposes the scanty straw on the stone floor of Pauline's dungeon with the comfortable homes in which the other women throughout the city were able to raise their children in domestic bliss. The Victorian women reading this would have been familiar with the process of procuring childbed linen and preparing the birthing bed. The grim description of Pauline's cell might have elicited sympathy from the women, causing them to have to think about giving birth to their own children on a cold, hard floor. The disparate experiences of Pauline and the white middle and upper-class Victorian audience highlights how the social inequalities of the time manifested themselves through different access to medical care, textiles, and comfort. What textiles and clothes would enslaved women like Pauline have had access to in order to deal with their bodily fluids? In contrast, what textiles would have been available to the white and affluent mothers mentioned in the article? What can the textiles that pregnant, menstruating, and postpartum people used during these pivotal times of life tell us about their lives and societies in the colonial Atlantic world? What were working women, both free and unfree, doing to control the flow of menstruation, discharge, leaking breast milk, and other bodily fluids as they performed strenuous labor in both the public and private spheres? How did social class and race affect the textiles people used during menstruation, maternity, and postpartum? The majority of written primary sources only mention the socially taboo topics of menstruation, pregnancy, and childbirth indirectly, and often use general terms such as clout or rag to refer to textiles used for intimate, private, or base purposes. This work utilizes diaries, letters, household accounts, newspapers, paintings, engravings, and photos of extant garments to piece together the various textiles Atlantic women would have used throughout the various phases of reproduction during the early modern period. This study adds to a growing body of work on the history of menstruation by focusing on the material culture and textiles of menstruation rather than the sociocultural history. The small amount of literature there is regarding the textiles and material culture of sanitary hygiene and menstruation blood management began only around 1854, when mass-produced products such as sanitary belts began to enter patent offices in the commercial market. What were menstruating women doing for the tens of thousands of years prior to the availability of sanitary belts and mail-order catalogs? To understand what and how women dealt with their menstrual and other bodily fluids, we must first understand how early modern women would have viewed their menstruation. The humoral model of the body dominated Western European ideas about the body from ancient Greece all the way through the early modern period. In the humoral model, women were seen as naturally colder and wetter than men. Humoral theory explained menstruation by saying that women had excess blood they had to dispel. Menstrual discharge was viewed as a corruption that needed to be drawn out and away from the body, so women would likely not have used tampon-like inserts since they wanted to draw the corruption out of the body. Rather, women would have wanted to absorb the blood with what we would consider pad-like contraptions. When pregnant in the humoral model, the excess blood fed the fetus. The belief was that lactating mothers also did not menstruate because their menstrual blood was turned into milk to feed their infant. For most of Western history, women's undergarments for the lower half of their body consisted of loose-fitting skirts, which is not conducive to easily inserting or adhering absorbent devices in the way modern women's Western underwear is typically designed. The idea behind all these loose-fitting undergarments was to allow women to relieve themselves without needing to remove any layers of clothing. This would have allowed women to relieve themselves in public while being protected by the modesty of their skirts. Popular contemporary sources on the history of menstruation have suggested that women simply bled into their clothes, using the base layer of the shift or chemise to absorb all bodily fluids. Undergarments were made of materials that were easily washable and were meant to absorb the sweat, fluids, and grime of the body while protecting the more valuable outer layers of clothing. Even when outer garments were cleaned, they were typically made of materials that needed to be spot-treated or brushed rather than fully boiled and laundered. Laundry was a labor and time-intensive process that typically involved hours, if not days of work, beating, boiling, scrubbing, drying, and ironing each individual piece of clothing. Would free bleeding have been practical? Would women have been willing to risk their valuable outer garments by freely bleeding into their shifts? Some feminist scholars, such as Sarah Reed in Thy Righteousness is But a Menstrual Clout, Sanitary Practices and Prejudice in Early Modern England, and Shara L. Vostrel in Masking Menstruation, The Emergence of Menstrual Hygiene Products in the United States, have attempted to intervene in this literature by drawing attention to the few instances where absorbent materials for bodily fluids are mentioned in the archives. Free bleeding would have been especially impractical for those in the lower and working classes. While upper-class ladies had the luxury of lounging around when they were feeling unwell or menstruating, they could withdraw to their rooms under the euphemism of being, quote, indisposed. They also had servants and women who would have laundered their clothing for them. Working women, however, both free and unfree, were rarely allowed any time to rest after giving birth, much less take time off each month when they menstruated. They also would have been responsible for laundering their own clothing and would have been very careful to avoid stains whenever possible. Before the technological advancements in fabric weaving of the Industrial Revolution, textiles and clothing were incredibly laborious and expensive to produce, rendering cloth a highly valuable commodity. Every piece of fabric would have been used and reused until, when it could no longer be repurposed into anything else, would have been cut down to be used as a clout or rag. Due to the high value of cloth, women, especially women of limited means who had to perform physical labor, would have been very careful to preserve their garments. Working women would have also needed to conceal the fact that they were menstruating so they could carry on with their lives and assimilate with the normal male working body, which typically did not menstruate. Women who did not have access to cloth would have used straw, sponges, moss, and, when available, fabric to absorb their leaking bodily fluids. Historian of early modern England Sarah Reed posits that women likely tucked the absorbent materials into their girdles, or that they would have fashioned some kind of diaper or belt to wear. Here's a picture of a wood cutting depicting a woman putting on men's brays or underwear. While this is meant to be a satirical caricature, it does give us insight into what women's tea bandages or homemade diapers may have looked like. It is even possible that women created their own version of brays to wear when they needed absorbent materials for vaginal discharge. The Industrial Revolution made fabric cheaper and more readily available than ever before. The advent of affordable fabric made it possible for more women to have multiple fabric towels and rags to absorb their menstruation and other fluids.